The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as David rolled his wheelchair up to his favorite spot outside Rosie's diner. At 42 years old, he had developed a routine that kept him grounded in this small town of Pine Valley. Every Tuesday and Friday, he would wheel himself down from his apartment 3 blocks away, order a black coffee and blueberry muffin, and spend an hour reading the local newspaper while watching the world wake up around him. David adjusted his worn baseball cap and unfolded the Pine Valley Tribune. The headline read, "Local business owners report increase in vandalism," something he'd been hearing more about lately in conversations around town. He took a sip of his coffee and let out a small sigh. 3 years ago, his biggest worry was whether his team would complete their mission successfully. Now he worried about things like whether Mrs. Chen's grocery store would stay open, or if the Henderson family would have to close their hardware store after 30 years. The transition from military life to civilian life hadn't been easy. The doctors had told him he was lucky to be alive after the explosion that took his left leg. Lucky wasn't exactly how he felt during those first months of recovery, learning to navigate the world differently. But Pine Valley had given him something. He didn't expect to find peace. The kind of quiet that let him sleep through the night without jumping at every sound. As he turned to the sports section, David noticed movement in his peripheral vision. 3 motorcycles rumbled into the diner's parking lot, their engines deliberately loud and aggressive. The riders wore black leather jackets with patches that read Iron Wolves across the back. David had seen them around town before, usually causing some kind of trouble at the gas station or harassing teenagers at the local park. The lead rider was a big man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. He shut off his bike and looked around the parking lot like he owned the place. The other 2 followed his lead, one tall and skinny with long, greasy hair, the other shorter but built like a weightlifter. All 3 had the same cocky swagger as they walked toward the diner entrance. David folded his newspaper slightly and watched them through the large front window. Inside, he could see Rosie behind the counter, a 60-year-old woman who had been running this place since before David moved to town. She was tough and didn't take nonsense from anyone, but these weren't regular troublemakers. These men had a different energy about them, the kind that made smart people cross the street or find somewhere else to be. The morning crowd was typical for a weekday, a few construction workers grabbing coffee before heading to the job site, an elderly couple sharing pancakes in the corner booth, and 2 businessmen discussing some deal over eggs and bacon. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that their peaceful morning was about to change. David had learned to read situations quickly during his years in the military. Something about the way the bikers carried themselves, the way they scanned the room as they entered, told him they weren't just stopping for breakfast. The big one, who seemed to be their leader, pointed at different tables and whispered something to his companions. They spread out slightly, positioning themselves in a way that blocked the main exit. Through the window, David watched Rosie approach their table with menus and her usual friendly smile. The leader said something that made her step back slightly. Even from outside, David could see the change in her body language. Her smile disappeared, and she glanced toward the kitchen where her husband probably was, preparing the morning orders. David set down his coffee cup and wheeled himself closer to the window. He had promised himself when he moved to Pine Valley that he would stay out of trouble, keep his head down, and focus on healing. The town had been good to him, accepting him without questions about his past or his disability. The least he could do was not bring his problems to their doorstep. But watching Rosie's discomfort stirred something in him that he thought he had buried. During his military service, he had sworn an oath to protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. That oath didn't come with an expiration date, and it didn't stop applying just because he was no longer wearing a uniform. The construction workers inside the diner were packing up to leave, clearly uncomfortable with the new arrivals. The elderly couple looked nervous, the woman clutching her purse tighter while her husband signaled for the check. The 2 businessmen had stopped their conversation entirely and were staring at their phones, pretending not to notice what was happening around them. David recognized the signs. These people were good, honest folks who worked hard and just wanted to enjoy their breakfast in peace. They shouldn't have to feel afraid in their own neighborhood diner. They shouldn't have to worry about whether it was safe to speak up or if they should just pay their bill quickly and leave. He thought about his team members, the ones who didn't make it home. They had died protecting people just like these, ordinary citizens who deserved to live without fear. The explosion that took his leg had also taken two of his closest friends. They would have expected him to do something if he could. David rolled his wheelchair back from the window and positioned himself near the entrance. If trouble was coming, he wanted to be ready. He might not be able to run anymore, but his mind was still sharp, his reflexes still quick, and his upper body strength had actually improved during his recovery. The physical therapy had been brutal, but it had taught him new ways to move, new ways to be effective. The door chimed as the construction workers left, nodding politely to David as they passed. One of them, a man about David's age with calloused hands and kind eyes, paused for a moment. "Morning's getting a little tense in there," the man said quietly. "Might want to find somewhere else for your coffee today." David appreciated the warning, but he just smiled and nodded. "Thanks for looking out for me. I think I'll stick around a bit longer." The construction worker shrugged and walked toward his truck, but David noticed he didn't drive away immediately. Instead, he sat in his cab with his phone in his hand, probably ready to call for help if needed. It was good to know there were still people willing to get involved when things went wrong. Through the window, David could see the situation inside escalating. The leader was standing now, gesturing aggressively while talking to Rosie. The other customers were clearly uncomfortable, but no one was doing anything. They were all hoping someone else would handle it, or that the bikers would just leave on their own. David knew better. Men like these didn't just leave. They pushed until someone pushed back, and if no one did, they kept pushing harder. They fed on fear and took advantage of good people's desire to avoid conflict. In small towns like Pine Valley, they could terrorize an entire community just by showing up and making their presence known. The morning was about to become very different from what anyone expected. David finished his coffee, straightened his shoulders, and prepared himself for whatever was coming next. Sometimes being a good neighbor meant more than just keeping your lawn neat and saying hello on the street. Sometimes it meant standing up when standing up was the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost. He was no longer the same man who had left for military service all those years ago, but he was also no longer the broken person who had returned home in a wheelchair. He was something new, someone who had learned that real strength didn't come from what you could do with your legs, but from what you were willing to do with your heart. David wheeled himself through the diner's front door, the little bell above chiming softly as he entered. The atmosphere inside felt thick and heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The three bikers had taken over the center table, spreading themselves out in a way that made the small restaurant feel even smaller. Their leader, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, was leaning back in his chair with his boots up on another seat. Rosie stood behind the counter, her face pale but trying to maintain her professional smile. Her husband Pete emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. David had eaten here dozens of times and had never seen Pete look so uncomfortable. The older man's jaw was set tight, and his eyes kept darting between his wife and the unwelcome visitors. "Look what we got here," the big biker announced loudly as David rolled toward an empty table near the window. "Wheels just rolled in. Hope you got handicap parking out there, buddy." His two companions laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. The skinny one with long hair slapped the table. "Yeah, maybe he can teach us some tricks. I always wondered how those things work." David positioned his wheelchair at his usual table and calmly reached for a menu, even though he knew it by heart. "Good morning," he said politely to Rosie, who hurried over with a coffee pot. "The usual, David?" she asked, her voice slightly shaky. David could see her hands trembling as she poured his coffee. "That sounds perfect. Thanks, Rosie." David kept his voice steady and normal, hoping to give her some comfort. But the bikers weren't done with their entertainment. "Rosie, is it?" The leader's voice boomed across the small space. "That's a pretty name. Tell you what, Rosie, my boys and I are real hungry and we've been riding all night. How about you bring us the biggest breakfast you got and we'll forget about paying today. Consider it a donation to some traveling businessmen. Pete stepped forward from behind the counter. Now hold on there. This is a family business. Everyone pays for their food here. The stocky biker with the shaved head stood up slowly. Did Grandpa just tell us what to do, boss? He cracked his knuckles loudly. Maybe Grandpa needs a hearing aid. David watched the scene unfold, his military training automatically cataloging everything around him. 3 opponents, all probably carrying weapons. 2 exits, the front door and the back entrance through the kitchen. 6 other customers still in the restaurant, all looking scared and trying to make themselves invisible. The elderly couple in the corner had already paid their check and were gathering their things to leave. Pete, just give them what they want, Rosie whispered, but her voice carried across the quiet restaurant. That's smart advice, the leader said, standing up to his full height. He had to be at least 6'4" and probably weighed close to 300 pounds. Your wife's got more sense than you do, old man. The businessman at the counter booth suddenly stood up, threw some money down, and headed for the door without a word. The other businessmen followed quickly behind him. David didn't blame them. Most people weren't trained for this kind of situation, and running was often the smartest choice. But running wasn't always an option for everyone. Ah, look at that, the skinny biker said, pointing at the fleeing customers. We're scaring away the breakfast crowd. That's bad for business, ain't it, Rosie? The leader walked over to the counter, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak. Tell you what, we'll make this real simple. Free breakfast for my crew, and we'll put in a good word about this place to our friends. A lot of bikers come through this area. Could be real good for business. And if we don't? Pete asked, though David could tell he already knew the answer. Well, the leader smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. Let's just say bad things happen to businesses that don't treat their customers right. Broken windows, flat tires, health inspector visits. You know how it is. David took a sip of his coffee and continued watching. These weren't random troublemakers looking for a free meal. This was organized intimidation, probably part of a larger pattern. The leader's words about other bikers coming through the area suggested this was how they operated. Find small businesses in quiet towns and squeeze them for regular payments. The elderly couple was trying to leave quietly, but the stocky biker stepped into their path. Where you folks headed in such a hurry? Breakfast just getting started. Please, the elderly woman said softly. We just want to go home. Course you do, sweetheart. But it's rude to leave in the middle of a conversation, don't you think? David set down his coffee cup a little harder than necessary. The clink loud in the tense silence. All 3 bikers turned to look at him. Something wrong with your coffee, Wheels? The leader asked, walking over to David's table. Maybe you should find somewhere else to drink it. Coffee's fine, David replied calmly. Just enjoying my breakfast, same as everyone else here. The skinny biker laughed. Hear that, Tank? He thinks he's the same as everyone else. So the leader's name was Tank. David filed that information away. Names were important. They made people feel more human, which could be useful or problematic depending on the situation. Tank leaned down, putting his massive hands on David's table. See? That's where you're wrong, friend. You ain't the same as everyone else. You're different, special, and special people need to be extra careful about where they go and what they do. David looked up at Tank without flinching. He'd faced down enemy soldiers in places most people couldn't find on a map. A small-town bully, no matter how big, wasn't going to intimidate him. I'm just trying to have breakfast with my neighbors, same thing I do twice a week. Your neighbors? Tank straightened up and looked around the restaurant. These people ain't your neighbors, boy. They're just folks trying to mind their own business. Maybe you should learn to do the same. The message was clear. Stay out of this, mind your own business, and maybe nothing bad would happen to the man in the wheelchair. But David had spent too many years protecting people to back down now, even if the stakes were different. Pete was reaching for the phone behind the counter, probably trying to call the police. The skinny biker noticed and shook his head. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Pops. Phones can break real easy, just like windows, just like old bones. Rosie grabbed her husband's arm. Pete, please, just give them the food. David watched the fear in her eyes and felt something familiar stirring in his chest. It was the same feeling he'd had overseas when innocent people were threatened by those who thought they could take whatever they wanted, through fear and violence. Some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The elderly couple was still trapped by the stocky biker, who seemed to be enjoying their fear. The few remaining customers sat frozen in their seats, afraid to move or speak. This wasn't just about a free breakfast anymore. It was about power, control, and showing an entire community that these three men could do whatever they wanted to, whoever they wanted. David finished his coffee and carefully set the cup back on its saucer. His voice was quiet but clear when he spoke. "You know what? I think I'm going to stay and finish my breakfast after all." Tank's eyes narrowed as he stared down at David. The big man wasn't used to people defying him, especially not someone he thought would be an easy target. He pulled out the chair across from David and sat down heavily, the metal legs scraping against the floor with an awful sound. "You know what I think?" Tank said, leaning forward. "I think you got a hearing problem, along with your other problems." He gestured toward David's wheelchair. "Maybe I need to speak louder so you understand." "Me better." David calmly unfolded his newspaper and opened it to the local news section. "My hearing's fine, thanks. Just reading about the town council meeting. Says here they're discussing increased police patrols in the business district." The skinny biker, who had been blocking the elderly couple's exit, laughed nervously. "Boss, did you hear that? He's talking about cops." Tank's face darkened. "Cops don't scare me, Wheels. Especially not the rent-a-cops they got in this little town. Sheriff's department's got maybe 3 cars for the whole county. Takes them 20 minutes to get anywhere." "Interesting," David said, turning a page of his newspaper. "Sounds like you've done your homework." "Damn right I have." Tank was getting louder now, his voice carrying to every corner of the diner. "This whole stretch of highway belongs to the Iron Wolves. Every business, every truck stop, every little family restaurant like this one. People pay their dues or they learn the hard way why they should have." Rosie was standing behind the counter, tears starting to form in her eyes. Pete had moved, closer to her, his arm around her shoulders. David could see them whispering to each other, probably trying to decide if they should just give in or keep fighting. The stocky biker with the shaved head started walking around the restaurant, running, his finger along the surfaces of tables and chairs. "Nice place you got here," he said to no one in particular. "Real nice. Be a shame if something happened to it." He stopped at the elderly couple's table and picked up the salt shaker, examining it like it was a precious artifact. "These look expensive. Everything in here looks expensive. Must cost a lot to replace if things got broken." The elderly man finally spoke up, his voice shaky but determined. "Leave us alone. We haven't done anything to you." "Course you haven't, Grandpa. Nobody's done nothing to nobody. We're all just friendly folks having a conversation." The stocky biker set the salt shaker down a little too hard. But conversations can go different ways depending on how friendly people want to be. David folded his newspaper and looked directly at Tank. "You know, I've traveled a lot in my life. Been to places where people thought they could control others. Through fear. Want to know what I learned?" Tank leaned back in his chair, amused. "Sure. Wheels. Educate me." "Fear only works as long as people believe you're stronger than them. But strength isn't always what people think it is." The skinny biker walked over to join the conversation. "You philosophizing now? That's cute. Real cute coming from someone who can't even stand up." David didn't react to the insult. His years of military training had taught him that staying calm under pressure was often more effective than getting angry. "I also learned that bullies usually travel in groups because they're too scared to face anyone alone." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Tank's amusement disappeared completely. "What did you just say?" "I said bullies. Travel in packs. Like wolves, I guess. Except real wolves hunt for food. You guys are just hunting for easy money." Tank stood up so fast his chair fell backward with a crash. The sound made everyone in the diner jump. "You got a real smart mouth for someone in your condition." "My condition?" David asked, genuinely curious. "What condition is that?" "You know, damn well what condition. Sitting in that chair, can't walk, can't run, can't fight. Completely helpless." David smiled for the first time since the bikers had arrived. It wasn't a friendly smile. Is that what you think? The stocky biker had moved behind David's wheelchair, probably thinking he could intimidate him from behind. The skinny one was off to the side near the counter where Rosie and Pete were watching in horror. Tank was directly in front, his massive fists clenched. I think, Tank said slowly, that you're about to learn a very important lesson about running your mouth when you can't back it up. David's newspaper was still folded in his lap. He glanced down at it casually. Actually, I think you're the ones about to learn something. See, you made a mistake when you walked in here. Yeah? What mistake was that? You assumed you knew who you were dealing with. Tank laughed, but it sounded forced. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Some tough guy wannabe who thinks he's still a soldier or something. Let me guess, you served in the military? Got yourself blown up and now you're bitter about it? David's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Lost my leg saving my team from an IED. Spent 18 months learning to walk again, then gave up walking and learned to do everything better from this chair. The stocky biker behind him snorted. So what? You expect us to salute you or something? War hero in a wheelchair is still just a guy in a wheelchair. You're right, David said calmly. I am just a guy in a wheelchair. But I'm also a guy who spent 12 years learning how to neutralize threats in close-quarters combat. And right now I'm looking at 3 threats who think they know how this is going to end. Tank's confidence was starting to crack, but he was too deep in to back down now. You threatening me? No, David replied. I'm giving you information. There's a difference. The elderly woman at the corner table suddenly spoke up, her voice stronger than anyone expected. Harold, call the police. Her husband immediately reached for his phone, but the skinny biker was there in seconds, grabbing the device out of his hands. I don't think so, Pops. That was when David moved. He spun his wheelchair around so fast that the stocky biker behind him stumbled backward. In the same motion, David grabbed the edge of the table and used it to pivot, positioning himself so he could see all 3 men at once. Interesting, David said, his voice still calm. So you'll steal from old people too. Good to know where your moral line is. Tank was getting frustrated. Nothing was going according to plan. The man in the wheelchair was supposed to be scared, not giving tactical assessments. Shut up and mind your own business, or we'll make you mind it. This is my business, David replied. These are my neighbors. This is my community. And you're threatening people who can't defend themselves. Can't defend themselves? The stocky biker laughed. What about you? What makes you think you can defend anybody? David reached down and quietly released the brakes on his wheelchair. Want to find out? The 3 bikers looked at each other. Something had changed in the last few minutes, though they couldn't quite put their finger on what. The scared customers were still scared, but they were watching David now instead of trying to hide. Rosie and Pete were standing straighter behind the counter. Even the elderly couple seemed less frightened. Tank made his decision. Boys, I think our friend here needs to learn some manners. Time for his lesson. David's hands moved to the wheels of his chair. I was hoping you'd see reason, but I guess we're doing this the hard way. Hard way. Tank sneered. For who? David's smile returned, and this time it was genuinely friendly. For you. Tank took a step forward, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak under his weight. All right, tough guy. Let's see what you got. But before he could take another step, David did something none of them expected. He rolled backward quickly, putting space between himself and Tank while positioning his wheelchair near the wall. In one smooth motion, he grabbed his coffee cup and threw the remaining liquid directly into Tank's face. Tank roared in surprise and anger, wiping coffee from his eyes. You little... David was already moving again. He spun his wheelchair sideways and used his momentum to ram it directly into the shins of the stocky biker who was trying to flank him. The man yelped in pain and stumbled backward, crashing into an empty table. What the hell? The skinny biker shouted, finally realizing this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. David's military training had kicked in completely now. Every movement was calculated, every position chosen for maximum advantage. His wheelchair wasn't a limitation, it was a weapon. The hard metal frame, The spinning wheels, his powerful upper body strength developed through years of adaptation. Tank lunged forward, still half blind from the coffee. David waited until the last second, then rolled to the side. Tank's momentum carried him past the wheelchair and directly into the wall with a tremendous crash. Pictures fell from their hooks and the whole building seemed to shake. "Stop him!" Tank yelled, his voice filled with embarrassment and rage. The stocky biker had recovered and was coming at David from the left. David grabbed the edge of a nearby table and used it to pivot his wheelchair around, swinging the footrest like a club. It caught the biker right in the knee with a solid thunk. The man went down hard, clutching his leg and cursing. The skinny biker was the smartest of the three. Instead of charging blindly, he grabbed a chair and held it like a shield. "Easy there, soldier boy. Nobody has to get hurt here." "You're right," David said, breathing a little harder but still in complete control. "Nobody has to get hurt. You can all leave right now and we'll pretend this never happened." Tank had recovered from his collision with the wall and was standing again, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Nobody's leaving until this freak learns his place." "My place?" David asked, positioning himself so he could see all three men. "My place is protecting people like Rosie and Pete, people like Harold and his wife. That's what I've been doing my whole adult life." Behind the counter, Rosie was on the phone. "Yes, we need help at the diner on Main Street. There's a fight." The skinny biker heard her and moved toward the counter. "Hang up that phone, lady." David intercepted him, rolling his wheelchair directly into the man's path. "She's not part of this. Leave her alone." "Get out of my way." The skinny biker swung the chair at David's head. David ducked and grabbed the chair legs as they passed over him. Using the biker's own momentum, he twisted the chair and pulled. The skinny man lost his balance and fell forward, right into David's waiting fist. The punch caught him square in the solar plexus, knocking all the air out of his lungs. He dropped to his knees, gasping and wheezing. Tank was furious now. "That's it, I'm going to tear you apart." He charged again, but this time David was ready with a different strategy. Instead of moving away, he rolled forward to meet the charge. At the last second, he grabbed Tank's belt and used the big man's own momentum to pull him down. Tank's legs got tangled with the wheelchair and he crashed to the floor with David still holding onto him. "Here's the thing about combat," David said, maintaining his grip on Tank's shirt. "It's not about size or strength. It's about training, timing, and keeping your head clear." Tank tried to swing at David from the ground, but the angle was all wrong. David easily blocked the punch and responded with a short, sharp jab to Tank's shoulder that made his whole arm go numb. How are you doing this?" Tank gasped. 12 years of training," David replied, "plus 3 years of learning to fight, from a wheelchair. Turns out when you can't rely on your legs, you get really good at using everything else." The stocky biker was trying to get back up, favoring his injured knee. David rolled over to him and grabbed his wrist as he tried to stand. With a quick twist, a move he'd learned in hand-to-hand combat training, the biker's legs gave out, and he was back on the floor. "Stay down," David advised. "Your knee's already hurt. Don't make it worse." Around the diner, the atmosphere had completely changed. The customers who had been cowering in fear were now standing up, moving closer to see what was happening. Pete had come out from behind the counter with a baseball bat, though he didn't need to use it. "The police are on their way," Rosie announced, still holding the phone. Tank was still on the floor, cradling his numb arm. "This isn't over," he growled. David positioned his wheelchair so he was looking down at all three bikers. "Yes, it is. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get up, walk out that door, get on your bikes, and leave town. You're not going to come back to this diner. You're not going to bother these people, and you're not going to tell anyone that a man in a wheelchair just took apart 3 tough guys. And if we don't," the skinny biker wheezed, still trying to catch his breath. David's expression grew serious. "Then I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here. How 3 big, tough bikers got beaten by a disabled veteran in a small-town diner. Think that'll be good for your reputation?" The elderly man, Harold, stepped forward with his wife. "We saw everything," he said firmly. "These 3 men were threatening innocent people. This young man was just defending us." "That's right," Pete added, still holding his baseball bat. "David here's a hero, always has been." Other customers started speaking up too. They were trying to rob the place. They threatened to hurt Rosie. David saved us all. Tank looked around the diner and realized that everything had changed. Instead of scared victims, he was facing a room full of witnesses who had just watched him get humiliated. The story would spread through the small town within hours. Everyone would know that the Iron Wolves had been beaten by one man in a wheelchair. Sirens could be heard in the distance, getting closer. "Boss," the stocky biker said quietly, "we should go." Tank struggled to his feet, his pride wounded worse than his body. "This isn't finished." David rolled his wheelchair closer to Tank, looking up at the much larger man without a trace of fear. "Yes, it is. And if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays finished. Because next time I might not be so gentle." Tank stared down at David for a long moment, then looked around at all the faces watching him. Everyone in the diner was standing, together now, united behind the man who had stood up for them. The bikers were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of options. "Let's go," Tank muttered to his companions. The three bikers limped toward the door, their tough guy swagger completely gone. Tank paused at the entrance and looked back one more time. "You got lucky today." David smiled. Luck had nothing to do with it. As the door closed behind the defeated bikers, the entire diner erupted in cheers and applause. David sat in his wheelchair, breathing hard but smiling, surrounded by people who would never forget what they had witnessed. The sound of motorcycle engines roaring to life filled the air outside the diner. Through the large front windows, everyone could see the three Iron Wolves bikers speeding away, their tough guy image completely shattered. Tank didn't even look back as they disappeared down Main Street, probably hoping to get out of Pine Valley before the police arrived. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was electric. People were talking all at once, voices filled with excitement and relief. Harold, the elderly man, was the first to approach David's table. "Son," Harold said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. Those men were going to hurt my wife. I could see it in their eyes." David looked up at the older man and smiled warmly. "You don't need to thank me, sir. Just doing what anyone should do." "No," Harold's wife joined them, tears in her eyes. "Not anyone would have done that. Most people would have looked the other way. You could have been seriously hurt." "But I wasn't," David replied gently. "And neither were you. That's what matters." Pete came out from behind the counter, still carrying his baseball bat but grinning from ear to ear. "David, that was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Where did you learn to fight like that?" "Military training," David said simply. "Plus a lot of physical therapy that taught me how to use what I have instead of worrying about what I don't have." Rosie hurried over with a fresh cup of coffee and a plate of blueberry muffins. "This is on the house forever. You hear me? You never pay for another meal in this place." "That's very kind, Rosie, but no arguments," she said firmly. "What you did today, you saved our business, maybe our lives. Those men weren't going to stop with just one free breakfast." David accepted the coffee gratefully. The confrontation had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. His shoulders ached from the quick movements, and his hands were slightly shaky from the adrenaline. But seeing the relief and gratitude on everyone's faces made it all worthwhile. The police sirens were getting louder now. 2 patrol cars pulled up outside, their red and blue lights flashing. Sheriff Williams stepped out of the first car, a tall man with gray hair who had been keeping the peace in Pine Valley for over 20 years. "Everyone okay in here?" Sheriff Williams called as he entered the diner. "We're fine now, Sheriff," Pete replied. "Thanks to David here." Sheriff Williams looked around the diner, taking in the overturned chairs and the scattered napkins. "I heard there was trouble with some bikers. Where are they now?" "Gone," Harold said. "They left about 5 minutes ago. 3 men on motorcycles heading east on Main Street. I'll radio my deputies to keep an eye out for them," the sheriff said, then walked over to David. "You the one who dealt with this situation?" David nodded. "They were threatening the customers and trying to extort money from Pete and Rosie. I just encouraged them to leave." Sheriff Williams looked at the scene again, noting the tactical way the overturned furniture was positioned. "Military background? Navy, 3 tours overseas." "It shows," the sheriff said with respect. Mind if I get a statement from you? For the next 20 minutes, David explained what had happened while Sheriff Williams took notes. Other customers added their own accounts, all praising David's courage and skill. The story was consistent. 3 bullies had tried to intimidate innocent people, and David had stopped them. These iron wolves have been causing trouble up and down this highway for months, Sheriff Williams explained. We've had reports from businesses in 3 different counties. Problem is, they usually hit places where there aren't many witnesses and people are too scared to press charges. Well, they picked the wrong place today, Pete said proudly. As the sheriff finished his paperwork and left, word began to spread throughout Pine Valley. Within an hour, people were stopping by the diner just to hear the story firsthand. David found himself surrounded by neighbors he barely knew, all wanting to shake his hand and express their gratitude. You know, said Mrs. Chen from the grocery store, those same men came by my place last week. They said they'd be back for their protection fee. Now I don't think they will be. If they do come back, David said, you call me or call Sheriff Williams. Don't face them alone. A young man about David's age approached the table hesitantly. Excuse me, are you David? The one who... He gestured toward the overturned chairs. That's me, David replied. And you are? Tommy. I work at the gas station down the street. I wanted to thank you, but also, I wanted to ask you something. Tommy paused, looking nervous. I'm a veteran too. Army. Did 2 tours in Iraq. Been back for 5 years now, but I still have trouble with crowds, loud noises, that kind of thing. David nodded, understanding. PTSD? Yeah. Anyway, watching what you did today, it reminded me that being a veteran means something. That the training we got, the things we learned, they weren't just for overseas. We can use them to help people here too. That's exactly right, David said warmly. Serving doesn't end when you come home. It just changes form. Would you maybe want to get coffee sometime? Talk about it? I'd like to learn how you stayed so calm under pressure. David smiled. I'd like that very much. How about Thursday morning? Right here. As the day went on, more and more people stopped by to hear the story. David found himself becoming something of a local celebrity, though he tried to downplay his role. He kept insisting that he'd just done what anyone should do in that situation, but the people of Pine Valley knew better. They understood that what David had done required not just courage but skill, training, and a deep commitment to protecting others. He had shown them that heroes don't always look like what you expect, and that real strength comes from the heart, not the body. By late afternoon, the diner was busier than it had been in months. People were coming not just for the story, but to support Pete and Rosie, to show that the community stood together against bullies and troublemakers. As the sun began to set, David finally prepared to leave. He had been at the diner for nearly 8 hours, much longer than his usual visit. As he rolled toward the door, Rosie called after him. David, wait, I want you to have something. She handed him a small framed photo, a picture of the diner taken on its opening day 30 years ago. This place has always been about bringing the community together. After today, you're part of that history. David accepted the photo with genuine emotion. Thank you, Rosie. This means more to me than you know. As he rolled down Main Street toward his apartment, David reflected on how much his life had changed in just one day. This morning, he had been a disabled veteran trying to find his place in a small town. Tonight, he was a hero, a protector, and most importantly, a valued member of a community that needed him. The training that had once been used to serve his country was now being used to serve his neighbors. His wheelchair, which had once seemed like a symbol of what he'd lost, had become a tool for protecting others, and the quiet life he'd been seeking had transformed into something richer, a life with purpose, connection, and the knowledge that he could still make a difference. Tomorrow, he would meet Tommy for coffee and begin mentoring another veteran. Next week, he would probably hear from other business owners who needed advice on handling troublemakers. And twice a week, he would still come to Rosie's diner for breakfast, but now as more than just a customer, as a guardian, a friend, and a reminder that heroes come in all forms.